Hi everyone, welcome to the first ever Lanterna IB Econ video. My name is Freddie, and over the next couple of months I'm going to be uploading one video every week going through topic by topic of the IB Econ syllabus. Now, as you may know, the IB Econ syllabus is split up into four main sections. We've got microeconomics, macroeconomics, international economics, and development. We'll start right at the top and work our way through it. Now, the first concept in microeconomics is actually just understanding what a market is. Now, when we hear of the term market in real life, we might think of things like a food market or a street market, but in economics, a market is a slightly broader term. A market can actually be defined as any place where buyers and sellers can carry out an economic transaction. So any place where you can buy a good or service, or a person can sell a good or service. So street markets and food markets, they are examples of markets, but you can also buy things, say, online. So there's obviously going to be online markets. When we buy and sell things like assets or stocks and so on, which we'll talk more about later, that would be carried out on a financial market. So there's all these different types of markets. What is the common thread though? What's the same in all these markets? Well, it's that both of them have what we call demand and supply. Which leads us nicely into the first real topic in the IB Econ syllabus, which is the concept of demand. Now, what is demand? Well, demand tells us the quantity of a good or service that consumers are willing and able to buy at any given price. Essentially just saying, if the price of a good is here, how many people would buy that good? Okay? So let's set up an example to help us go through this a bit easier. So we're going to set up what we call a demand schedule, which you see here. Essentially just a table that shows us the price of a certain good and the quantity demanded of that good at the given price. So let's imagine we have a classroom of 20 students and I want to sell chewing gum to these students. Okay? Well, suppose I initially set the price of chewing gum to be €4. Well, at €4, that's quite a high price. Maybe no one in the classroom wants to buy chewing gum. So at the price of 4, the quantity demanded is 0. Suppose I set the price to be at 3 instead, €3. Well, maybe 5 students out of the 20 would want to buy chewing gum at that price. Okay? I could keep lowering the price. Maybe at a price of €2, 10 people wish to buy chewing gum. At a price of €1, we've got 15 people wanting to buy chewing gum. And then if I give away the chewing gum for free, if I set the price equal to 0, we'll assume that all 20 students want to buy chewing gum. Okay? So what we've just created is what we call a demand schedule. It's a table that shows us the quantity demanded of the good at different price levels. This is an amazing way to show what the demand for a product might look like. But what's limiting about this? Well, we know that the price doesn't just have to be, €1 or €2 or €3. The price could be somewhere in between. The price could be $1.50, $2.50, $1.25 even, right? So how do we show that in a better way? Well, we're going to create what we call a demand curve, which we're going to draw on a set of axes. So what I've set up here is a set of axes with the y-axis being the price and the x-axis being the quantity demanded of the good. And we'll keep going with this example of chewing gum. So if you remember, when the price of chewing gum was €4, the quantity demanded was 0. No one wanted to buy chewing gum. So that's going to be our first point. Let's show that in red. The first point is going to be price at €4, quantity demanded all the way at 0. But when we decrease the price to €3, 5 people wanted to buy chewing gum. When we decreased it again to €2, we had 10 people wanting to buy chewing gum. At a price of €1, we had 15, and at a price of €0, we had 20. Now, if we connect all these dots, we're going to draw what we call a demand curve. Now, if I'd have drawn it perfectly, those lines would obviously have lined up. So, what does this demand curve show you that the demand schedule doesn't? Well, the demand curve shows you at any price what is the quantity demanded. Remember, the demand schedule, the table that we had earlier, only showed you what the quantity demand is for the prices that you put in. This demand curve, because it's continuous, it shows us what the quantity demand is for all levels of price. Now, what can we see from this demand curve? Well, first of all, it's downward sloping. What does that mean? Well, downward sloping demand curve implies that as the price falls, the quantity demanded rises, right? As the price goes lower, the quantity demanded is higher. So essentially it's just implying that people are more willing and able to buy goods when the price is lower. We'll assume it's generally the case, and it actually is the case so often that we name a law after it. We name it the law of demand. The law of demand states that generally there is this inverse, or what we call negative, relationship between price and quantity demanded. As price falls, quantity demanded increases, right? As goods become cheaper, you're more likely to buy them. And conversely, as price increases, you would be less willing to buy them. Now, this seems quite logical, but it really comes down to two main effects, what we call the income effect of prices and the substitution effect of prices. One of the main reasons why you might buy things when they become cheaper is the income effect of prices. This generally states that if you have some kind of set income, maybe you earn $50,000 a year. At that income level, if the price of goods become cheaper, then you can afford to buy more things. If you were earning $50,000 a year and suddenly the price of the goods that you generally buy become cheaper, it means that you're now able to buy more of the good, hence you will probably buy more of the good. The other effect is the substitution effect of prices. The substitution effect of prices says that, hey, if the price of a good becomes lower, it's gonna look better in comparison to its substitutes. For example, if the price of Coca-Cola became cheaper, you're gonna be more willing to buy Coca-Cola than you are Pepsi, and therefore the quantity demanded of Coca-Cola will increase. So the law of demand holds for two main reasons. The income effect of prices, stating that as prices become cheaper, you can afford to buy more goods, and the substitution effect of prices, meaning if the price becomes lower, you're more likely to buy that good as opposed to its competitors. Next up is understanding what the non-price determinants of demand is. Now this isn't just a fancy way of saying what are factors that will cause the demand curve to shift outwards or inwards. Now, what does a shift in the demand curve really show? Suppose the demand curve shifts outwards to somewhere like here. So we go from this black demand curve to the red demand curve. What does that imply? Well, it shows that at any given price, so if we take this price here, suppose that price is €2. Well, now the quantity demanded after the shift in the demand curve is higher than it was before. As you can see, the quantity demanded after the shift might be 10, whereas before the shift it was only at, let's say, 7. This implies that after this shift in the demand curve, more people are willing to buy the product at the same price. Now let's think, what could be some factors that cause more people to be willing to buy a good at the same price? Well, let's go back to our example with the classroom. Suppose someone comes out with a study that shows that chewing gum is amazing for your health. We would assume that people will want to buy more chewing gum despite the price being the same. So in that scenario, because an article was put out that increased the preference and taste for chewing gum, the demand curve shifted outwards. So that's our first non-price determinant of demand. I'm going to call it taste, styles, and preferences. If something becomes more fashionable, more trendy, then the demand curve will likely shift outwards. On the other hand, if something becomes less fashionable or less trendy, the demand curve will shift inwards. Another non-price determinant of demand can be income. Suppose the students in our classroom become richer. We would assume that they'd be willing to pay more for the same amount of chewing gum because they have more money to spend. So an increase in income will also lead to an outward shift in the demand curve. And conversely, a fall in income will lead to an inward shift in the demand curve. A third characteristic that might shift our demand curve inwards or outwards is what we call demographic changes. If suddenly a few more people join our classroom, so we go from a classroom of 20 to 25 students, we would assume that there'd be a higher quantity demanded of chewing gum. If there's more students, we're more likely to sell chewing gum. So an increase in the size of the population will shift the demand curve outwards, whereas a fall in the population would likely shift the demand curve inwards. The last non-price determinant that we're going to look at is the price of related goods. Now let's go back to the example we talked about before with Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Suppose the price of Pepsi increases. Pepsi is now more expensive. What do we think is going to happen to the quantity demanded for Coca-Cola? Well, we can probably assume that the quantity demanded for Coca-Cola will increase. Because Pepsi is more expensive, consumers will be less likely to buy Pepsi and therefore more likely to buy Coca-Cola. Therefore, in our scenario, when Pepsi increased their prices, it shifted the demand curve for Coca-Cola out because more people were willing and able to buy Coca-Cola. On the other hand, if Pepsi were to decrease their price, consumers would be more likely to buy Pepsi and therefore less likely to buy Coca-Cola. So in that scenario, the demand curve for Coca-Cola would shift inwards because people would be less willing and able to buy Coca-Cola. The last thing we need to understand about the demand curve is the difference between a shift in the demand curve and a movement along the demand curve. Now, we've just explored a bunch of factors that may cause shifts in the demand curve. If you remember, we talked about taste, styles, and preferences, income, demographic changes, and the price of related goods. These are all factors that will cause shifts in the demand curve. So causing the demand curve to, say, go from the black demand curve that we see there to this new demand curve that I'm going to call D prime, D with an apostrophe. So any of those factors that we've talked about would cause a shift as such. So what is a movement along a demand curve? Well, we see a movement along a demand curve anytime we change the price of the good that we're considering. So let's go back to our example earlier when we were talking about chewing gum. If we decrease the price of chewing gum from 4 to 3 euros, we're going to move along our demand curve from the point up there to the point at which the price is 3. If we lower the price even more, we would move from that point down to where the price is 2. So we would go along the demand curve to where the price is equal to 2. So we'll see a movement along the demand curve anytime we change the price of the good that we're considering. But we'll see a shift in the demand curve anytime one of those 4 factors that we looked at earlier changed. Remember, taste, styles, and preferences, income, demographic changes, or the price of related goods. That's going to be the end of our first video going through what markets are and the basics of demand theory. Next video, we'll have a look at supply. I'll see you then.